So, nice to meet you all. Nice to meet Bengi Akbulut. Am I correct? She's an ecological economist. Maybe you can spend some words for saying better. Okay, that's wonderful. Because it could be useful. The title of the seminar, as you know, is The Ecological Case for Economic Democracy. This sounds very interesting because we don't, I mean, as far as I know, maybe I'm quite a bit ignorant about it, but anyway, as far as I know, we don't, we are not so used to combine economic democracy and ecological issues, especially in this country, I suppose. So it will be very interesting to follow the reasoning of our host. I don't take any minutes, just for saying you thank you very much for being here. As I told you, Bengi Akbulut is an ecological economist working in Montreal. Montreal at the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment. The floor is yours. I will follow you from there, so okay. It's better for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up because I speak better when I'm standing up. I don't mean to be intimidating, but
it's totally fine.
Don't take it personally. First of all, thank you for having me today, and thank you to Emanuele, my old friend, for inviting me and rescuing me from the cold of Montreal. This time, it's actually tropical here compared to Montreal. I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey, and I was asked to provide some context for the earthquakes and the kind of post-earthquake situation. But maybe we can do it afterwards if you want to know more about that, because it's not directly related to what I'm going to talk about today. I'll let them deal with it. So.
Però devi.
Sì, ci date un po'.
Esatto.
Okay.
You saved the day. So as the title of my talk
it's
coming suggests, today what I'm going to talk about, or what I'm going to try to kind of convince you, is to make to talk about economic democracy from an ecological perspective, actually kind of more specifically make an ecological case, in the sense that I will try to convince you that economic democracy is not only a desirable thing in itself for a variety of reasons, but it's actually necessary in order to, let's say, ensure sustainability or ecological sustainability in our economies. Before I start, 2 words of caveat. First of all, I'm not going to try to define kind of what economic democracy is. So my talk is not really about theorizing or kind of coming up with a definition of economic democracy. But for the purposes of today, I want you to go with a kind of a working definition of economic democracy as kind of a series or various extents of democratization, in the sense that people who are impacted by economic decisions are able to effectively participate in the making of those decisions. So I don't that could be, as I said, that could be various extents. So it's not a 0-1 game. We can talk about various degrees of democratization of economic processes, to say various degrees in which people who are stakeholders, who are impacted by decisions, economic decisions, are able to participate in the making of them. The second word of caveat I want to kind of start with is that it is a little paradoxical to be able to be making a case for economic democracy. So, I mean, we can also say, hey, even if economic democracy was not necessarily good for the environment, which I will be arguing it is, we should still uphold it. We should still support it. So my aim is not at all kind of provide a justification for economic democracy in that sense. I think it should be supported and it should be defended in itself. But I think there is value to think about it from an ecological perspective too. Can we change this?
Yeah.
Has anyone heard of ecological economics before? As a field? Okay, yes. Don't be shy. Raise your hands. Okay. I'm not going to ask you to put anything on it. You're not going to be tested or anything. I just wanted to get kind of a sense of the room. So ecological economics. Can we change this?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I kind of put you
Please,
to work
don't
already.
be.
Okay. Ecological economics is a particular field within heterodoxy in economics, so within kind of the school of heterodox economics. It's distinct in the sense, I mean, of course, this is not a kind of a, this is my definition, this is my reading, this is my kind of reading of or like interpretation of why ecological economics is unique or why it gives us tools. But it is distinct in the sense that of the vision, kind of it's kind of this pre-analytical vision that I will get to, but the vision of the economy, distinct from almost all other schools of thought, even within the kind of heterodox schools of thought in economics, in that it sees the economy as a biophysical reality. So according to ecological economists, the economy is not separated from nature. It is actually a subsystem, an open subsystem of the global ecological system. So the economy is not only monetary, so the economy can not only be seen as constituted of monetary flows, prices, demand, whatnot, the kind of indicators that we usually associate when we're talking with the economy, when we're talking about the economy, but it's necessarily biophysical, so it's constituted of energy and material flows as well. So one implication or kind of related to that is that ecological economics sees kind of the interaction between kind of the economy and the nature and other kind of subsystems of the global biophysical system to be co-evolutionary, not static, but kind of constantly co-evolving with each other. For ecological economics, the question of scale is central, so the scale of economic activity, and it cannot be reduced to efficiency or distribution. So we need to be talking about the sustainability of the economy in terms of the scale, how much resources are we extracting and how much waste we're generating, as a separate question that cannot be boiled to questions of distribution or questions of allocation, efficiency. And the last part, this is kind of the more institutional ecological economists, but ecological economists also see the economy as embedded in the social system. So broader political economy dynamics mediate the interaction, how we interact, how the economy and nature interact. So it's not kind of only a natural biophysical system, it's a biophysical and social system that we're talking about. Next slide. So I want to kind of, from this very, very quick overview of the school of thought, I want to kind of extract, delineate, and emphasize a few dimensions of this, or a few features, dimensions of this vision, what I call kind of features of the pre-analytical vision of ecological economists. So kind of the worldview and the features of this worldview that ecological economists build on. The first thing is, as you see, complexity, ignorance, and uncertainty. So the point is that ecological processes are marked with complexity, so we cannot really look at kind of lower scale or components of an ecosystem and understand automatically what the upper scale system is going to do. Complexity emerges from interaction of different parts of the ecosystem. Ignorance and uncertainty. So there are things about the nature, about ecosystems that humans cannot know, not because they don't have enough data or cognitive ability, because they cannot be known. So there is a fundamental component of unknowability, ignorance, about how nature will be acting or reacting in the future. So as this applies basically to the biophysical implications of our economic decisions today as well. So there is no way to actually accurately know what our economic actions today will have, what kind of impacts it's going to have on nature, on the biophysical system, either today or the future. And this is beyond uncertainty. So this is beyond kind of going through, okay, there are likely to be 5 outcomes of this course of action in terms of its biophysical implications, and I can or cannot assign probabilities to it, but I know the outcomes. But what I mean is there are certain things that we don't even know is possible, and we don't even know that we don't know. It sounds like a riddle, I know, but that's basically the point. And what that implies is that prices, whether imputed, so whether kind of shadow prices, where exercises to put a price on something that is not priced, that is not in the market, or actual formed prices in the market, cannot reflect every implication of an economic decision. So when we're talking about carbon markets, for instance, the price of carbon cannot reflect the cost, the actual accurate cost of using carbon. Not because there's like some things that we don't have data on, because it cannot. It's an ontological kind of feature. The second the second dimension of this pre-analytical view, as I call it, is interdependency. And that implies, not only physical, but social interdependency. That kind of points to, that is about the fact that the environment is a very particular kind of thing that is marked by social and physical interdependencies. So different parts of nature, different ecosystems need each other to exist. So we cannot really think about them as separate things. But also social interdependency in the sense that nature has many uses and many users. So what I decided to do, or what one society decides to do with nature, has a direct implication on what others can do. So the act of one directly influences possibilities for others, in the words of Ardwat and other institutional ecological economists. Again, kind of bringing it to kind of the dominant institutions of our economic systems. I'll make these connections more explicit in a minute, but what this means is atomistic decision making, in the sense that making decisions only by one unit without taking into account or finding ways to take into account of the implications of this decision on others will, that does not allow revealing how private decisions would affect others today or in the future. So the point is, the environment, decisions about the environment needs to be made in ways that reveal the interdependencies. Next slide, please. The third kind of fundamental feature is what is sometimes called value incommensurability, or more generally known as economic incommensurability. The intellectual roots of this notion goes back to at least Otto Neurath and to the socialist calculation debate. Another economist who was in basically a debate with Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian economist, about whether or not it's possible to make rational decisions in the absence of prices. I won't go into the details again, but the kind of take-home message of economic incommensurability is that there's no single unit of value, whether it be prices, monetary prices, or another thing, that captures, that can aggregate all values associated with a particular good, or all costs and benefits associated with a particular decision. So for ecological economists, market prices are thus not a relevant measure of value, because they can at best capture a subset of values associated with nature, for instance. Values that inform environmental valuations are plural and incommensurable, so you cannot really they're very different kinds of values that cannot be reduced to a single indicator. And because of that, ecological economists are quite skeptical against monetary valuations and kind of decision-making forms that build on monetary valuations of environmental goods and services, such as cost-benefit analysis. Next slide. And the fourth one, bear with me, this is the last one, that values are articulated, they're not given. So, which for ecological economists, individuals are not inherently anything. They're not inherently self-interested, or they're not inherently other regarding or collective. They have multiple rationalities and values, and individual preferences, what people prefer to do at a given time, are not immune from change. They can be changed. They're endogenous. Indigenous preferences are not exogenous in the terminology of neoclassical economics. An implication of this is that decision-making institutions, the contexts in which we make decisions, articulate our values. They do not neutrally reveal or express values, but they give us signals, they give us information, they frame decisions and choices in ways that change our mind and values, basically. So when you're making decisions in a market or market-like setting, those are institutions that encourage self-interest, that encourage self-interested behavior, because that's what you're expected to do in a market-like setting, which is very different than a collective community or a family setting. Right? There's a lot of research on how kind of markets can discourage cooperative action and crowd out ethical commitments and social forms of rationality, and actually reward and emphasize individual forms of rationality. So the more we act like market participants, the more we become market participants is kind of the takeaway. So what ecological economists kind of say, building on these, this kind of pre-analytical vision, is that they say, okay, the world works this way, individuals function this way, so building on this, we have to really think about what kind of institutions we use in making environmental decisions. So ecological economists are especially focused on the implications of these in terms of environmental decisions in the sense that I mentioned, so monetary valuation, cost-benefit analysis, for instance. So they're very critical of kind of atomistic, private decision-making forms when it comes to deciding what we do with the environment, whether or not we build a dam, whether or not we kind of, I don't know, destroy this forest and start an apartment complex. Decisions like the kind of a use of an environmental resource, they're very skeptical of kind of using market-like price-based forms of decision-making, like cost-benefit analysis, because these forms of decision-making are ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of sustainability, I will say, such as interdependency, such as uncertainty and ignorance, such as value incommensurability. Instead, they say, first, we need to use deliberative institutions, not atomistic private decision-making, but deliberative institutions that build on procedural rationality, so not individual rationality, but the process needs to be organized in a certain way, the process of decision-making. Reason dialogue through which an education, a political education of values could happen, and democratic participation. Such a process, according to ecological economists, would mobilize multiple and fragmented knowledges and viewpoints, from the perspective of which these uncertainties and ignorance and complexity, so this component of unknowable, inherent to the decision-making process, can be weighed and discussed. So rather than assuming that we can know and that this decision reflects kind of with certainty what's going to happen, the possible impacts of these uncertainties can be weighed and discussed from the perspectives of differentially situated stakeholders. And that judgments and preferences can be formed and altered through this process of deliberative decision-making. So you come into the deliberative decision-making process thinking that you want the dam to be built, or you want the forest to be destroyed and an apartment complex to be built, for instance, but then through the process, you would discover other people's values, and you would discover interdependencies between your choice and other people's possibilities. So that's the process of politicization, if you will. That's the process of value formation that could change and that could articulate different kind of values. But on top of that, ecological economists also say that in making decisions about whether or not to build that dam, we cannot only rely on monetary indicators, so the cost and the benefit of the dam, or where the environmental cost of its construction, for instance, would be translated into a monetary measure. Remember economic incommensurability. Ecological economists would rather say, hey, we need to use direct indicators of the multiple dimensions of this decision. Rather than trying to reduce them to one unit, we need to have multi-criteria that are not reduced to each other of the economic indicators, of the economic outcomes, biophysical outcomes, social outcomes that can be quantitative or qualitative. So the point is, for ecological economists, they build on this way of seeing the world and what they see as kind of fundamental features of reality, and they build a critique of what is kind of right now the mainstream status quo way of making decisions about the environment, which is kind of monetary valuation cost-benefit analysis. Next slide, please. What I'm going to try to do is to extend this pre-analytical vision and to argue that this should apply to all kinds of economic decisions, not only the decisions that directly involve the environment. And that's because, first of all economic decisions have a biophysical implication, because the economy is biophysical, but all the more so today as we are approaching or actually passing planetary limits. So any kind of economic decision will have implication, whether or not we build this, whether or not we produce this thing, whether or not we consume this thing, has implications in terms of resource use and waste generation. That has basically the same kind of implications that environmental decisions hold. Next slide, please. And particularly, I will try kind of to make a case that the dominant institutions of our economies, the dominant institutions of capitalism, the market, and private enterprise, are themselves ill-equipped to deal with challenges of sustainability, ill-equipped to deal with uncertainty and ignorance, interdependencies, and economic incommensurability and value articulation themselves. They are doing the wrong thing. They're the opposite of what you should be, how economic decisions should be made. And instead, I will kind of make a case for how a democratic process and the institutions and economic decision-making would reveal kind of interdependencies, would allow comparison of multiple dimensions by non-monetary indicators, and would also allow revision of social collective determination of values and preferences. So we'll start with the markets. So the markets are a decision-making institution in the sense that the promise of the market is decentralized decision-making in allocating productive resources to their most preferred end. So I don't know how many of you actually have taken economics. I know it's not very sympathetic, pleasant topic, subject probably. But the idea behind markets is that consumers kind of register their preferences by going out and buying things, right? By kind of effectuating demand. And that demand, sometimes price going up, gives a signal to the producers to produce more of that thing. So when you come to kind of an equilibrium quantity of whatever the market of we're talking about, that is actually an implicit decision of the society to say, hey, we want this quantity of shares, so implicitly, indirectly, we have made a decision as a society to allocate a part of our productive capacity, our labor, our factories, our wood, to the making of that share. So why the market is supposed to be a superior way of doing this, because we don't get together and like in a room, all of us, all of Bologna, and try to deliberate on how many chairs we actually want, so we don't spend time or resources on trying to make that decision. The market does it for you. We don't even know we're making that decision. We're just acting based on our preferences. But at the end of the day, the market is an institution of economic decision-making of where to allocate our productive capacities. But it is one in which that we make this decision privately and in an atomized manner, right? We don't talk to each other when we're actually thinking about how many chairs we want to buy. We don't really think about the resource allocation question. We don't really think about the implications of our demand for chair on others, both human and non-human. So it's an atomized decision-making. It does not really give us any way of revealing the interdependencies. It doesn't give us any way of revealing the uncertainty, complexity, and ignorance that is implied. So the price of the chair is supposed to reflect the cost of its production, but it doesn't really tell us that that cost lacks a lot of information about the ecological implications of its production, of the chair's production, and what that might mean in the future. So it hides that uncertainty and ignorance. It's a price-based decision. Again, prices can be at best capture a very small subset of what is at stake. And it is a market's perpetuate reward, individual rationality, instigates commodity framing and encourages self-interested behavior. So it's a way of making a decision where we are kind of encouraged and perpetuated to pursue our self-interest. It kind of, markets put us in atomized private kind of mentalities. It also kind of rewards this mentality. If you try to be friendly in a market, you're screwed, basically. But I mean, let's go back to the decision, to the example I gave. I know it was kind of a caricature, but what I will propose won't be too far off. All of Bologna, or all of University of Bologna coming to an assembly and discussing where to allocate our productive resources. In that stage, can we change the slide? In that example, in that situation, we would be able to actually reveal what is at stake in terms of the biophysical implications of our decision. Should we produce this many cars? And then someone will say, yes, I want many cars. I think we should produce a lot of cars because that's the future. And someone else says, yes, but in order to produce this many cars, we would have to use all of our aluminum to produce cars. But then, like, how are we going to produce chairs? Because we need aluminum for chairs too. So then we would start kind of, that would give us a way to discover the interdependent implications of our demand decisions, of our allocation decisions. It would also serve as a process of, again, reason dialogue. So the deliberative process itself could change, could articulate different kind of values, which could go beyond self-interest. So this is a caricature example, but there are more kind of realistic and actually existing examples of democratic alternatives to the market mechanism. One of them is more macro scale, democratic economic planning. So you might have heard of Parecon, Michael Albert, you might have heard of Adaman and Devine's negotiated coordination. These models especially proliferated in before 90s, then kind of stopped, but are being discussed again in the context of the kind of intertwined crisis that we're in. I will say a few words about that later, of kind of not leaving this allocation of productive capacities decision to the market, but rather make this decision not through a central kind of committee, but by people making different kind of deliberative institutions and assemblies at different scales, like the University of Bologna Assembly, and making this decision through a democratic participatory process. Organized consumers, organized producers, coming together and actually kind of negotiating how much of what to invest to which sector. Community-supported agriculture is a micro-scale example of that. So a lot of the main idea behind community-supported agriculture is that consumers and the farmers coming together and discussing about what to produce, how much of the land to allocate to which produce, what kind of methods to use in the production. And through that negotiation, it's not private atomistic decision making about allocation, where again, the process of deliberation would open up space to address some of the issues that I raised. So to kind of, to sum up, these examples portray mechanisms envisioned by ecological economists to deal with issues of complexity and uncertainty, interdependencies, value articulation, and incommensurability. Social and ecological consequences, actual or potential, associated with alternative courses of action, can be debated and weighed from different perspectives and knowledges of those who participate, could reveal interdependencies. Use of non-monetary criteria can come in, unlike markets, like broader concerns like ecosystem health, biophysical limits, and social equity can figure in and do figure in these alternatives. And articulation of social and ethical values is a lot more possible than this decentralized private market interaction. What my colleague Simon Chamblay-Papin calls, for instance, thinking on behalf of society in relation to democratic economic planning. So it opens a space for participants to come into that debate and not only express concerns or what they demand as an individual, but are forced to think from the perspective of the society, kind of publicness that is implied in this institutional setting. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
The second kind of dominant institution of economic decision-making is the capitalist firm, the private enterprise. And the main decision that is made through the private enterprise is obviously production, right? What to produce, how much to produce, how to produce, so the technique, and what to do with the surplus, so where to invest the profit, is made, again, in a private atomistic manner and based on price signals. Cannot deal with the intertemporal costs and benefits of production decisions. It cannot account for the broader implications of private decisions on others, so the interdependency part. And it does, private enterprise actually perpetuate a pursuit of profit, cost-shifting, and perpetuates pursuit of self-interest. What would be the alternative? It's again, kind of, it's not rocket science. We do have non-capitalist enterprises, non-capitalist forms of producing things such as cooperatives and eco-social enterprises, which again, to varying extents, display forms of decision-making that ecological economists have argued are better fit to deal with challenges of sustainability. Participatory and democratic governance, opening up of the decision-making to a broader involvement and a wider involvement. In worker cooperatives, it's the worker members. In solidarity cooperatives, which is a form that we have in Quebec, and I think you have in Italy, where it's the producers, consumers, and community members who become members of the cooperative and are involved in the making of decisions. It's even a broader kind of base of decision-making and deliberating. How am I doing in time?
All right, no problem.
Deliberation and production and investment decisions can kind of, again, is the deliberative mechanism itself is better fit to deal with uncertainties and interdependencies. A broader range of demands and values, apart from monetary concerns and monetary indicators, can involve, can guide decision-making, so a multi-criteria decision-making, and cooperatives can cultivate, share, and can articulate different kind of values, cultivate values such as sharing, community, solidarity, and conviviality through this collective process. In a punchline, it's not easy to be an asshole when you're with other people, basically. Right? Okay, so my last slide. Why is this important? I mean, apart from this being an intellectual and political project for me, why is it important and why does it apply, or how does it apply to today and some of the debates that we're witnessing or being a part of today? The first one is kind of current debates on transition and kind of mainstream debates, some of them kind of more radical left debates, but there's a kind of this general debate on transition. We need to get out of this crisis. We need to get out of this fossil fuel economy. We need to get out of this capitalism, especially in relation to the ecological collapse that we are witnessing. But a lot of these debates go kind of, or implicitly or explicitly talk about these two characteristics of capitalism as if they are two separate things: the unjust, undemocratic nature of capitalism and its unsustainability. And of course, there's like a political and intellectual tradition that problematize both of these these features of capitalism. And of course, they don't see this as like kind of politically separate questions, but there's somewhat of an agreement that these are analytically two different features of capitalism. What I'm trying to kind of say here is rather that making our economies more democratic and just will itself be a barrier against their ecologically destructive nature as well. So these questions are not as separate, and the project of transition is not as kind of maybe overwhelming as it seems. And kind of more particularly around kind of, for instance, transition visions such as the Green New Deal or just transition, where the climate catastrophe is seen as a matter of, or how we get out of it or how we deal with it is seen as a matter of getting the investment, right? So it's a matter of allocation. So it's a matter of getting out of fossil fuels, getting investment out of the wrong place and putting it in the right place. And you see that even in kind of visions of very anti-capitalist visions of transition as well. What I'm kind of suggesting here is that that's not it. I mean, or that's not all of it. We need to also have a vision, a clear vision of how we govern economic decisions. What kind of institutions are we going to build for governing our economic decisions if we want a kind of a truly fundamental, radical, sustainable economy. The second point is debates on planning. This is kind of my little nerd obsession, planning and democratic economic planning. But if you're ever kind of following, again, like some of the more left debates on transition, there's a lot of talk on planning, especially in the last few years. If you read Amjad's mom, for instance, he's all for central planning. We need to take over the state, and then the state is going to kind of take over whatever kind of green, every kind of sector from top down, because we don't have time. We need to do it like fast and efficient and very manually. Anyway, that's kind of my little stab at it. But what and like a lot of this kind of planning debates is, and partly and very understandably driven by the urgency of the issue, but also kind of the hyped urgency of the issue is kind of central, fast, top-down planning, kind of against the irrationality of capitalism. And again, you know, what ecological economics gives us is that no. I mean, doing this top-down is ill-fitted. We need to have, so democratic, deliberative, participatory planning of economic activities is needed. It's what we need, actually, in order to actually deal with the biophysical nature of our economic decisions. So again, kind of this more left or radical debate on on planning needs to have this kind of critique. And the third one, which I don't obviously have an answer for, but it's kind of a, whenever I talk about this, this is where the discussion kind of evolves to. I talked about economic democracy as if we can do it like right away, right? I mean, even if like University of Bologna gave us like, okay, go build your assembly of allocation of resources. There are definitely existing power relations in our societies that need to be curbed, that need to be addressed, that need to be, so the distribution of power is kind of a corollary to many of the things. Redistribution of power in a more equitable way is a corollary to a lot of things I said. So I didn't even get to kind of what kind of problems could emerge from kind of the democratic or within democratic and deliberative mechanisms of decision making on the ground. But also, I mean, thinking of what kind of, let's say, non-reformist reforms we could ask for today in order to democratize our economies, what kind of redistribution of power or what kind of curbing of corporate or kind of economic power should we or could we ask for in order to, again, kind of move towards a more progressive or progressively move towards a more democratic economy, I think is kind of the political strategy part of this talk that I hope you have answers to. So I'm going to end here and thank you for having me again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Bengi. And while you think about possible questions, of course, they are very welcome. And take into account yesterday, for example, for those of you who are taking the class Ecology and Labor in the Anthropocene, we were discussing a little bit about degrowth, because Bengi today didn't talk about degrowth, but she will tomorrow. And in any case, she knows quite a lot about that. So if you want to ask her anything about this issue, please feel free to. And right now, I'm going to, in a second, talk about something that happened yesterday, which hasn't received extensive coverage as the election of the new secretary of the Democratic Party. But let me say one thing about the new secretary of the Democratic Party, because basically Matteo Vescovi sent us, and yesterday we were discussing about that, the daily broadsheet La Repubblica, who used to be the voice of the center-left in Italy, and then it has been bought by the Fiat family and stuff like that. So well, I mean, let's discuss about good old times, but other than that, it wasn't really the editorial, but like, one opinion piece, like, it wasn't just saying how things happened. Stefano Cappellini is one of the main journalists in La Repubblica today, and his argument was like, well, one of the challenges in front of Elly Schlein, this is the name of the new leader of the Democratic Party, will be to resist the sirens of degrowth. Okay, like, she needs to tackle environmental issues, because, I mean, those issues are real, but she needs to do that reasonably. Okay? I mean, the expression was within reason, so thank you for sharing the article. Just to say that in the end, somehow as a return of the repressed, like, unconsciously degrowth keeps popping up in political debates. But yesterday another thing happened, and only one newspaper talked about that, but that was quite important because there has been a unitary assembly of two federations of the main trade union in Italy, CGL, chemicals and metal workers. And basically those are the two traditionally most conservative and most, I was going to say revolutionary, but like, most non-reformist, let's say, souls of the Italian main union. And basically the point of the unitary assembly, 300 delegates, the general secretary of the union and the minister of labor and economic development, they were discussing basically the joint challenges of ecological transition and digital transition, basically. And the point was because, I mean, we were talking about the prerequisites of economic democracy, and other than institutional arrangements, as Bengi Akbulut described us quite compellingly, there is also need to analyze institutional actors and not just institutional. And up until, I would say, yesterday, but I always exaggerate with, finding breaking points. Like, in any case, in general, up until recently, main unions have been quite aligned to market actors when it comes to ecological transition, because they adhered, that there was a general agreement about the main tenets of the green economy. We will, those of you who will follow the class, we will have a couple of lectures devoted to this. But in general, the idea was, well, ecological constraints have been perceived as economic obstacles because we were, ill-equipped to face them. But right now, there's no way, there's no reason why we cannot keep together value production in capitalistic terms, so accumulation, and environmental protection. If we do things properly, which means financializing, carbon market, and stuff like that, all stuff we will see, we can keep the two together. And the unions, at least in Italy, have been saying, okay, just the more you grow, the more jobs we will have, the more resources to be redistributed we will have. So using basically the same model for this period for the contemporary period, which is everything in Europe but forest. What is the important outcome of yesterday's unitary assembly? Is, well, on the one hand, it's always nice to see unionists quarreling with ministers. That's okay. But I will say resolutions, but probably it's not the right term. The final documents of both federations were basically saying, you see, during the pandemic, okay, all the new resources linked to new deficit have been managed publicly. So that allocation was first organized in non-market ways, and supposedly, then it wasn't the case in Italy at least, but supposedly it should have passed through parliament. Okay, so in theory, the main decision maker is not a market force, but a political one. And mainly CGL is now asking that ecological transition, because when it comes to digital transition, it's more complicated, and I would say rightly so from the union perspective, but we may talk about that. But when it comes to ecological transition, since it is, according to the union, an emergency just as deadly as the one brought about by the coronavirus, then the same emergency resources and the same way of treating them, so publicly, not through market forces, should be enforced. And basically, Landini, Secretary General of CGL, and Urso, the current minister, quarreled precisely about that. Because the point is that the government at the moment is not saying it's impossible to find new resources. The point is, we need to wait for another governance in Brussels because we want more protectionism. So if the European Union give us more space to operate in protectionistic terms, we will have more money to spend on national terms, and there may be some more resources for this transition. But the management of this is going to be up to market forces. Okay, so the very first press conference by the new government was like, we will not stand in the way of those who want to do something. Okay, and those who want to do something are firms, okay, private firms first. So even if it is just a unitary assembly, although the last unitary assembly of chemical workers and metal workers was in 1972, where there weren't 3 unions in Italy, but just one, FLM, so quite a long time ago. In general, this may be, and it is quite relevant for the teams we deal with in this class. This may be a little bit of an inversion of a trend, okay, which may go in the direction of putting economic planning to the forefront of the debate about ecological transitions, which has not been the case so far in Italy. So this is just one point. When we talk about just transition, Green New Deal and stuff like that, it's not just institutional settings, it's also actors, and it's also, if you want, like the transformation over time of their positions. Because I mean, I agree with you about the several shortcomings of both just transition and Green New Deal. Don't worry, the students of our class, we will talk about that in detail. But the point is, how promising is that some actors who wouldn't be interested in that even 2 years ago are now seeing in those kind of programs something to be interested in, like, something to discuss publicly at the very least. And again, I have no idea right now. Back in the day I had some, but not now, about Canada, and not as much about the US as well. But in Europe and Italy especially, this is kind of a novelty. So I think it's worth pointing that out. And the other two small things I want to just, for you, for the discussion afterwards, and then I leave the floor to everyone. If you want to say something, you're welcome, of course. About the cooperatives, this is, how can I say that? In English, it's tough to find a proper way. Like, it's difficult for us in Emilia-Romagna to talk about that because we have plenty of cooperatives, and the history of these cooperatives is good. Like, something we can, I can easily relate to. And right now they are one of the most powerful market forces we have in this region, and actually working conditions especially. I mean, truth be told, when it comes to environmental impact, of course we should go and see the details of the calculation and stuff like that, but it seems that the cooperative system is doing better at the very least than the private system, so that there may be something there, but when it comes to working conditions, the two are basically the same. So probably what you were saying about, like, the more general political shift in order to enforce processes with, truly distributional effect when it comes to power relations, probably are are the main point. Like, the institutional setting counts, it is fundamental, but then which kind of force you can mobilize to make it actually what it claims to be is just equally important. And then, like, just a curiosity, the impression I have is the same as you. Like, in recent years, planning has come back, at least in the academy, like, in the academic world, as an interesting topic to discuss and investigate. By the way, Andreas Malm will be in Italy for the World Congress of Climate Justice. So, like, you can actually come and see and listen with your own ears.
Don't tell them I said anything about it.
No, but actually, you actually pointed towards the kernel of the problem, because, like, clearly it's reasonable to say, like, there's a urgency and we need to take action, and democratic planning or central planning, and of course democratic centralism is another complicated issue, but it makes sense to say, like, in the abstract, that's the way to go. But then where to find the subjective forces to make that process truly democratic? That's the issue, because, like, technically speaking, we don't lack data or models about how to allocate properly, how to, like, even how to make good decisions. Like, we have procedural rules that can be radically democratic, but how to find forms of mobilization which give these procedures a truly democratic content, not just a form, a substance, well, that's a little bit problematic. And in the end, probably Malm's solution tends to be, like, if things are good at the beginning, garbage in, garbage out. Like basically, if you have good stuff at the beginning, then central planning as it envisages it works. But the problem is at the moment we don't have good stuff at the beginning. So like, how to produce that is a question. And also, you were referring to, I'm closing down here. Like, then,
There will be another also.
yeah, oh, but by the way, this is, no, because I said that on Facebook. After this, those who want are invited. We can go and have a beer or whatever. Not just beers. You can have your alcoholic drink, Davide. You won't be forced, not pressuring. But we can keep discussion if you want. So you were mentioning the socialist calculation debate, and I am positive. Like some of you may correct me if I'm wrong, because it may be, but I don't think that there is in Italian any book or article on this issue, which is a fascinating one. This is, imagine the Red Vienna context. So you have, I mean, Otto Neurath is studied in this very department as an epistemologist, but not at all as one of the main figures of this debate. And then we have, for example, the long and complicated debate in the Soviet Union in the 20s, which wasn't really about the calculation debate. So it wasn't a problem of how to calculate the output or how to allocate properly in order to get the output you desire. But the point was like, is value, not value as a category as you were discussing, but like, economic value if we want, like, the value capital C's value. Is it an objective or a subjective entity? Because if it is subjective, then planning means something, and you cannot think about that without democracy. Or is it objective? And then you had Rubin and Isaac on the two different sides. And of course, Rubin ends up in a gulag, and the other one gets to the ministry. But probably that debate should be, I mean, my opinion, I am in that as well, of course, but there may be space to get back to that debate, because I do think that if the part of your talk about the incommensurability of value and how ecological economics allows us to not even think about that, like, it is a given. Okay, like, you cannot have that because price is necessarily partial. If we add that there is an objective partiality, like the one that the price signal, but then you have always a subjective partiality, which is what do we do with that? What you were saying, like, the how much, when, who of production. Like we will call it in our class the qualitative composition of production. Okay, which is always not a given, but the result of given of particular relations in society, and that may be interesting, but we will go over that later on. So now, if some of you wants to interact, like clarifications, comments, questions, whatever you want.
He wants to interact, I think.
Yeah.
Or no?
No.
Okay.
In fact, I was saying that, but knowing him, I was.
Maybe a few things I can say on that, and maybe that's gonna warm people up to other things. I think like one thing that really kind of is at the heart of this question of this topic, and a lot of what you say is then what's production, who's the worker, who produces, like whose production we're talking about, right? Because I have talked about cooperatives, I have talked about kind of allocation of productive capacities, but then like this is a very kind of a value producing or commodity producing centric view of what's the basis of production. But a lot of what we're talking about also has the production of nature and production, social reproduction and social and ecological reproduction in it. So, for instance, labor unions are always kind of the main institutional actors in any discussion of just transition or planning. But who do they represent? They represent workers who are commodity producers in different kind of sectors. But this discussion should happen, both kind of the parties of planning, the stakeholders in the kind of mechanisms I was trying to outline, but in any kind of debate on transition, it's more than that. It's not only commodity producers who is implicated in this, because commodity production always happens predicated on ecological and social reproduction. So workers of ecological and social reproduction should be in a union, should be in this planning discussion, should be in every kind of, I think this should go together with an expansion of what is working class, or who is producing, or the notion of production and kind of class. And I think one thing that degrowth, or at least like one wing of degrowth is trying to do is that, and that I think opens up different kind of actors, political actors, and different kind of movements that are already happening as a part of like this power redistribution, or the subjects who could make this process more democratic and more just. So then like indigenous actions of land occupations or blockades become a part of like a working class movement in a way, because they are kind of there for ecological reproduction in a way. Or like, I mean, any kind of care work or social production work, transport workers, healthcare workers, educational workers. So I think unions is just like, I think unions cannot be necessarily a subject of making this process more democratic in the way that they are today. I mean, and it's the same in Canada. So it should be other forms of labor who are life-sustaining or life-producing, but are not commodity-producing, should be seen as kind of partners and stakeholders and subjects in this debate. And they are organized, maybe not in union forms, but they are organized. So that's one thing I was thinking, and that's why like I always think about the solidarity cooperative as an institutional form, as an important invention, let's say, because it's a way of making decisions about what that cooperative is going to do with like all kinds of stakeholders that are going to be impacted by that decision, not only the workers or the consumers. So it's a way of like a microcosm of like bringing together everyone who's like producing and reproducing that unit in a way. The second thing I was thinking, I mean, so about planning, and again, and I'm glad you brought in unions, and it's like in Canada, I don't think, like they are kind of asking for a similar kind of, let's say, a kind of an intellectual and actual guidance from the public, or from the public sector, from the state. So I think there's like this nostalgia of like going back to that kind of state managed social state, and you know, good jobs, green jobs, accumulation. It's very, very true. I'm not very, I mean, as you might have understood, I'm not very hopeful of unions in that sense. But I mean, for instance, when I talk about planning and democratic planning, I always have a notion of scale in my mind that is never so explicit. But of course, I mean, in terms of the reality of the institutional structure that would be required to do democratic planning in the sense that I described, which kind of also, because I'm a degrowther as well, I think it needs to go with like localization and scaling down. And for me, planning more than, and this is like, although I'm an economist and I was trained as one, although I'm in a geography department, every time I have a fight on planning, and I will say a fight because it usually turns into a fight, with non-economists who are talking about efficiency, and like the economist who's talking about kind of autonomy component of planning, because for a lot of like non-economists, planning, it goes back to the socialist calculation debate as well. Like they are trying to defend planning as a form of, hey, we can make decisions as efficiently as markets. Or like we should not spend like some kind of cost effectiveness of planning. And for me, planning is about self-governance. It's about autogestion. It's about making decisions, taking ownership of our decisions, becoming different political subjects. And this is the way, for instance, Pat Devine talks about it. He says, by participating in decisions that shape our lives, we become different subjects. We define our political subjectivity differently. That's how we learn to make decisions. You might not know what you're talking about in the beginning, but like that's the point, to empower everyone to be kind of planners of their economic lives. So I think there's a need to also kind of de-link this planning discussion from its economic imperative, in the sense like, how much time will it take? And I'm like, I want it to take time. I want to be able to make these decisions. So that kind of, so I think like that autonomy part goes also with kind of self-governance, self-determination, scaling down in order to be able to do that, scaling down and slowing down, which kind of brings me again to prerequisites of economic democracy in that sense. Like in the autonomy sense, we need to have, like, we need to not be working this much. We need to have, like, we need to be able to afford to participate in these decisions. So I think there's like a prerequisite set of demands that needs to be fulfilled first, so that we can have time to talk forever about like what we're going to do with the little backyard or something. So I think like that kind of, what kind of a political project, apart from an economic project, a political project planning is, democratic economic planning is, should not be boiled down in kind of questions of urgency or in questions of cost effectiveness or efficiency. I think like the point is not to replicate what a capitalist economy could do. This is actually more Staub looking at socialist calculation debate and saying, why are you guys so like obsessed about kind of showing that a planned economy can replicate what a capitalist market could do? If that's the point, like why do we need planning? He's like, I hope it does something different. So I feel the same. I hope it does something different.
No, I'm totally in agreement, but I do think that it makes a difference, like, the 20s in the 20th century,
yes, of course,
and the 20s in the 21st. And like, the link between I can do as good as you do quantitatively, and I can do better than you qualitatively is more complex than just like, I can have the second if I refuse the first.
No, of course.
It's more, but in any case, I get the point.
No, I didn't take it. No
I know, and yeah, there will be time. Of course, there's a possibility to pose the question in Italian and then I translate. Tomorrow we will do like this in the other talk.
I try to ask.
Thanks a lot, Albert.
I ask a very thank you so much for the presentation. I want to stress a little bit about the term democracy nowadays in these trajectories of growth, because I think both in institutional situation or in the polycrisis that we are leading on, and in the recent histories of social movements around the world, this kind of term was challenging a lot in the last 15 years. And I really catch the point on prerequisites on economic democracy, but I really I don't know, sometimes I have the impression that this term that was still important has like has for fighting in different ways in the last years, nowadays is disappearing as something important in the very common sense. And meanwhile, we are in a war regime where for our side they are telling us that we are the democracies against the authoritarianisms in the past years. So I really worried about like he's still useful this concept for imaging a new economy together with a new politics from below, because I understand when you speak about agricultural communities or other cooperatives. I used to live in Barcelona and Catalonia, where fortunately the anarchist tradition grew in the years a better tradition of cooperatives till nowadays. But yeah, so I can understand that in the very material productions and material alternatives that we can find. But I really asking myself if democracy is still the word that we have to fight for.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
Well, I could call it communism, but I don't think it's better.
Beep, beep.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Or communalism, which is what the Kurdish freedom movement calls democratic communal economy, right? You're right, and I was thinking, but I mean, also I was thinking, the Kurdish freedom movement is one kind of political movement that I was very closely engaged with, and I worked with when I was living in Turkey, and especially kind of this notion of democratic communal economy, which is the economic dimension of democratic confederalism. And it's kind of a joke because it's like every institution that the movement has built and every paradigm they named, it has the word democratic in it. The democratic nation, democratic people's congress, people's democratic party. It's the region's democratic party. It's everywhere in a way. But I mean, if you go to a meeting, if you go to a commune and you tell them what you're doing is democracy, they will look at you weirdly in a way. So what I guess, I mean, it depends on the context. It depends where you're speaking from and where you're speaking in. Kind of the salvageability, how much we can rescue the concept of democracy. I completely agree. I think it has been co-opted by first kind of a notion of parliamentary democracy. And I mean, if you speak to kind of a liberal capitalist apologist, they will say market is the ultimate democracy because you have choice. You basically, marketplace is a place where you exercise your democratic choice over what you want and what you want to kind of consume. I mean, paradoxically, it's a democracy that depends on not one person, one vote, but how much you have money. I mean, that kind of this escapes from kind of this notion of democracy. But I think one thing that I think, and it's quite tainted too, right? I mean, a lot of imperialist wars ongoing in the name of democracy. But I think one thing that it has not, economic democracy as kind of it's almost like an oxymoron when you're speaking about it in kind of at the core countries and kind of, or you talk about worker democracy like Rick Wolf is talking about, right? So kind of associating democracy with kind of with terms that it has not come together with to kind of provoke a thinking, kind of partly utopian and partly to show the very undemocratic nature of our economies, I think is still a useful tool. At least in North America it is. So when I teach, it is. When I teach, I kind of and talk about economic democracy, my students do understand in the kind of very fundamental undemocratic nature that the economy is run. So I think for me it does in that context. For the Kurdish freedom movement, it does because they are fighting a colonial state. So, but I mean, maybe here it's not the word. You're very right. I mean, the first kind of political economy course I took when I was a graduate student was with Rick Wolff and Steve Resnick, these two American Marxists who kind of tried to rebrand Marxism and kind of against kind of the orthodoxy. And the way that they describe capitalism in their undergraduate courses is kind of talking about surplus value, profit, and about how decisions about profit was being made by only the capitalists and how fundamentally undemocratic that was in the US. So that was kind of a pedagogical strategy they chose and I kind of followed, I think. But yeah, and kind of to bring it back to the Kurdish freedom movements, I think that their democratic communal economy project is very much kind of planning from below, and this is something that Martha Honecker, which kind of worked in Latin America and like very much at kind of from the bottom up kind of participatory planning experiments, because the idea is to people of a commune getting together, a village getting together and discussing what do we need, how are we going to use our land this year, and then forming a unit of production. They call that unit of production cooperative, but it's a very kind of, it's not an institution, it's not a building, it's kind of a form of cooperation durable over a season. They meet their needs, but everything is kind of discussed in the assembly. And that is kind of at its core planning from below and kind of democratic planning, which kind of is inspiring for many reasons, but like inspired me to write about economic democracy too. So, but I definitely, I agree.
Bando?
Yes,
Tu?
three, many, no, I don't know.
Non l'avevo visto Matteo, va bene? Facciamo...
No,
Vai.
just a short question because my English is not so good.
Don't worry.
So, what we have to do with the state? Can we transform it in something that we can use in this democratic way, or it is a problem?
Well, I grew up with the Turkish state. I don't think it can be transformed into anything. So, no, I mean, it depends, right? Again, this is you are in the land of Antonio Gramsci. You have to have a conjunctural analysis, no? It depends. I don't think the state as an institution can be transformed, but this is more my political experience rather than my analytical kind of expertise at this point. But I mean, analytically, I think it depends. For instance, a state like Turkey, part of its reason for justification, its justification for its existence in the Gramscian sense, its hegemonic kind of project is very much based on development, modernization, progress, growth. So in order to make that state act in kind of sustainable ways, democratic ways, whatnot, it's a very big project of turning a ship around. So I think it depends on how states make themselves and justify their existence in a way, like how they relate with what kind of hegemonic project they are operationalizing. But I think like for this kind of, you need some kind of coordination mechanism, but I think state is not only a coordination mechanism, it's a political institution. So I don't think we can live very much with the state as a political mechanism. So and like this kind of, as I said, I mean, I think this vision will necessarily require a local self-governance and self-determination in a scale that we don't have in nation states. So I find it very much fundamentally at odds with it. But I mean, if you ask me, like, do we go after the state first, or do we do other things? I wouldn't go after the state first. I would rather shallow it out as a strategy. So I think we need to take state seriously as part of ecological politics and the politics of economic democracy, but it doesn't necessarily mean to take it over. I don't really believe that works.
Thanks. Vando?
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. 3 points about, and I'm interested in knowing your comments about it. The first one is about discipline. In the first part of your presentation, I was thinking that, okay, that sounds very familiar. This economic ecology is very much similar to sociology in the end. So I recognize myself in your points, but I was also wondering, what about the other economists? What is the relationship? What is the space that ecological economics has and received in the debate inside that discipline? Because this could be interesting. It could be interesting to observe a sort of evolution of the economics towards sociology. In the meantime, sociologists are doing the opposite, so it could be interesting to follow the movement. The second point is about, I was wondering if you have any knowledge, or if you never read a growing literature. They call themselves ruin thinking, or critical infrastructural studies and things like that. And it's interesting because they are producing quite interesting, I mean, many of them are related to the, let's say, the pragmatist perspective, John Dewey, William James, and so on and so forth. And this is interesting because it is very close to your insistence on the bottom-up approach to the transformation, social and ecological transformation. So I was wondering if you know these debates, because maybe there could be an interesting synergy. And the third point is about what seems to me a missing point in your picture of the situation, that is about a dimension that I didn't find in your picture, that is what Bernard Stiegler calls the symbolic misery. I mean that in my view, one of the most important dimension of what you call the bottom-up planning, or the self-determination in the decision of combining social justice and ecological justice and so on and so forth, is about the, let's say, the cultural, in a very large meaning of this concept, the cultural dimension, the social desirability as a cultural dimension. And this is one of the main problems in my view, because the economic actors you was mentioning are very able in let's say, in modifying cultural attitudes, cultural perspectives of the common people. And so I was wondering, I can imagine that in some parts of the world there is this cultural orientation to self-determination and bottom-up planning and so on. But I'm also quite conscious that in many parts of the world, especially where the economy is more, I mean, the capitalist economy is more able to determine the cultural attitudes. I suppose that it's not so easy to find social desirability, so the disposability of the people, the viability of the people to spend time, to spend energies in order to planning from the bottom, the perspective you were talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. Very, very good questions to think about. Let me start with the discipline. I think I'm the only economist in the room, and I'm not even like, I don't even count as one because no one thinks I'm an economist.
If it can help, I sit in the board of the European Society for Ecological Economics, thanks to your votes. She campaigned for me, so yeah.
You are not an economist.
Get the
I'm not an
non-economists on the board.
I'm not an economist, that's for sure.
I mean, I studied economics in my undergraduate, and then I which was in Istanbul, and I was utterly disappointed after my first year because all we did was math. And then I did my PhD in University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is one of the very few heterodox programs in North America, which is kind of dedicated to, used to be, radical political economy. That's how I kept studying economics, which is really kind of not in a department that is very much not representative of how economics profession is evolving or how it was taught. Ecological economics is, so that the kind of the picture I presented is very much my identification with it. So not every ecological economist would come into this room and would explain ecological economics this way. So I came to it as a Marxist feminist economist who kind of was looking for some systemic critique in ecological economics, and those were the currents I discovered. More the feminist ecological economics and institutional ecological economics, which kind of talks more about the kind of human preferences, whether people are self-interested or not, how institutions work, what should be the focus of economics. So if you look at kind of the flagship journal of the International Society for Ecological Economics, a lot of the articles you see won't be too different than maybe mainstream. But and that's a continuing fight within the community of people who self-identify as ecological economists. But I think like there's a school more mainstream kind of neoclassical economics that does look at environmental questions, and according to that school, it's more kind of environmental problems are a matter of market failures. So certain things are not priced, or they don't have property rights over them. Pollution is not paid for, or the resources we use are not paid for. So the problem is one of not having enough markets, not having enough prices, not having enough property rights. So we corrected. How do we correct it? We put a price on it. So one kind of foundational difference that kind of consolidated, I think, the School of Ecological Economics was a critique of that monetary valuation tactic. and the limits of it, and that, but I mean, some people would kind of say it's only about maybe the biophysical component. For me, it's a more fundamental ontological critique of how the world works and an epistemological critique of mainstream economics. So I guess this is and I love going to I teach ecological economics exactly like this to students who've never heard of ecological economics. So now they think it's this kind of more radical project than its average is. So, but you're right, and it's necessarily an interdisciplinary discipline. A lot of the kind of intellectual roots of ecological economics come from energy economics, systems thinking, so kind of less social science, but more physical scientists who are talking and thinking about the society and the economy in energetic and material terms. Then, like, there's also kind of more social science and institutionalists like William Kopp, and kind of looking at the institutions. So in that sense, social institutions that fix and give some kind of stability to economic processes, and what kind of incentives and kind of durable incentives and behavioral patterns they give rise to, and its implications in terms of environmental and social implications, basically. So you're very right in that sense. It's close to sociology, both in terms of methods and in terms of focus of, I guess, object of study. The second question, I mean, I can talk forever about like history of economic thought, but I won't. I think I would be the only one who's interested in that. The second question, you're very right. I mean, of course, it is. I mean, if we just take a snapshot of societies today, we could say that I think in terms of the social desirability of kind of bottom-up self-determination mechanisms or self-governance mechanisms. But I think I don't think that's a given. Like I think, and that's why I always kind of talk about articulation of values when I talk about this issue too, because the first kind of, when I talk about more democratic communal ways of making decisions, the first thing my students say is, oh, but people are self-interested, they're greedy, they would never, like, why would they change their minds? And then I give them kind of a lot of, I try to convince them that it's not the case, that people can change. And then comes the end of the semester, I still get papers where people write, people are greedy, we need to educate them. I don't know how education gets rid of greed either, but anyway. I think it's not as it's not as static or inherent as culture implies. I think it's a matter of historical and institutional construction. This predisposition. I think and I completely understand why, but I think, for instance, certain movements, certain struggles for self-determination always kind of portray themselves as like, it's the same with the Kurdish freedom movement. It's like self-governance is in our genes, is in our culture, and that's strategic, and that's important to say it that way, but I think it can be in everyone's culture. I think it's a matter of instituting that kind of political subjectivity. But of course, I mean, and I think there's been, like, in every culture, there's a form of social cooperation and self-determination at some level. Of course, when we try to scale that up, then it gets trickier, and I think there definitely needs to be some kind of political disposition, if not kind of cultural disposition, some kind of desire to do that, because it's not something that you can I think there needs to be, if not, I mean, social or political desirability of this. And that could be a terrain of political struggle, I think. That's the kind of, so how do we have subjects that will desire to self-govern? But I don't think it's as kind of as patterned or maybe static as culture could imply.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation and for being here with us. I have a small question. Are you sure that we can describe cooperative enterprises, agroecological communities, and also the way in which indigenous people organize themselves with the idea of non-capitalist form of organizing? So the question is it possible to imagine something completely outside of capitalistic system? Because I think that all these experiences need to interact with the capitalistic organization inside the frame of a capitalistic society. No? So I prefer to use the idea of prefigurative politics to describe this experience, or something that acts inside the capitalistic system and against it. Instead, you use the term non-capitalist form of organizing or post-capitalist form of organizing. It is a little bit different, no? So I have to ask this.
Good question. Okay. I probably do not understand capitalism as totalizing a system as you do.
Okay.
And it's a matter of, I mean, it's not a matter of who's right or wrong. I think it's a matter of approach, right? So I understand capitalism always to be constituted by non-capitalist moments. So capitalism does require an entire subsistence sector for its workers to be, right? I mean, it depends where we're talking about, obviously, but it requires subsistence farming in many countries so that the cost of labor production and reproduction is low for capital. It requires social reproduction, so it requires many forms of non-capitalist forms of cooperation and or production to happen in communities, in households, in villages, and whatnot, in workplaces, in order, it not only requires, but it's always kind of articulated and constituted by non-capitalist practices. This does not mean that this articulation or constitution happens on an equal kind of ground. So I think capitalism has a tendency to, or capital has a tendency to exploit, to destroy, to use. So I think it's a diverse terrain, the economy. I don't think it's all capitalist, but I also think capitalism is kind of the parasite there, and it does have more power than the other things. So that's why I say non-capitalist, but I also don't mean non-capitalist as necessarily just like, you can have like a very feudal-like system of production that's very unjust, but still non-capitalist. I think it's important how we see it, and I think, I don't think I would disagree with calling these prefigurative either, but I think I'd rather choose not to kind of conceptualize it as an all-encompassing system, because it's important to see how capitalism is constituted with non-capitalism, like how the labor of nature or labor or ecological processes and cycles mediated through, for instance, subsistence agriculture or agroecological practices, how that is articulated as a mode of production with capitalism, which gives us where capital reproduces itself, which gives us a place to start organizing, a place to kind of struggle. So, it's not a coincidence that a lot of kind of militancy against capital is now from ecological struggles, which is like one kind of articulation of capitalism with kind of non-capitalist modes, right? Or kind of, or care workers, so social reproduction. So these are kind of two key points of contact that is heated and now kind of striking, nature striking or social reproduction workers striking will be a huge crisis for capital. So that's why I'd rather kind of politically and analytically, I think it's more suited for what I'm trying to get across. So thank you, that's a good question.
Ma siccome l'ultima
Davide
volta
e then
ci sono
Giada.
domande. Chi c'era?
Giada, ma
Ah, prima c'era. Hanno parlato solo uomini. Hanno parlato solo uomini.
hai ragione.
I don't understand anything, but yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's not a question, it's more facts that I want to share with you since you are in Bologna. I don't know if you, how long have you been here, like today or?
Yesterday,
Okay.
but I've been here like 9 years ago with my completely different, it was after the Gezi uprising in Istanbul and I came with my political collective to do a tour of social centers. So
Okay,
definitely
so
different, in a different hat than,
Okay. Okay, so recently after 2 years of struggle by ecological movement here in Bologna, the municipality decided to establish the first citizen assembly in the city it's called Climate Citizen Assembly. The idea of the movement was to put people together by extraction, so residents of the city that should decide what's the most urgent problem, let's say, in the city regarding the climate, regarding the ecology, etc. And to discuss together first the problem, so to picture what is the problem and how to deal with the problem. So this was the idea of the movement, why the movement fought a lot to have this, and finally the municipality decided to establish this citizen assembly, but at the end they already decide what should be, let's say, the purpose of the assembly, that is to allocate public lands in the city. So the assembly should just decide, okay, we want to make Bologna climate neutral, we want to make Bologna a solar city, so the assembly should decide where is the best place, or how much we should. So just, let's say, quantitative allocation. So my question, or, yeah, it's not a question, but what I see is that the risk that, let's say, planning, from this point of view, can be really depoliticized as an instrument, since someone from the top down define the goals, but let the people just to define the discuss, let's say, the discussion, where to put the resources. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
It's very true, and it's very good point. I mean, I would say the same thing with with social solidarity economy, right? I mean, this kind of movement of cooperatives can also, like, I come from Quebec, which has also, I don't come from, I live in Quebec, but I mean, I literally came from Quebec, but which also has like this huge kind of cooperative sector, but it's very much provincial state led. It's very much a part of Quebec, and that's like Quebec development, social development. So it's very much conceived from the beginning and like kept in line as a third sector. It has no say or kind of a power or a desire to kind of say, hey, like we want more democratization of like how resources are allocated. And it's very much kind of, okay, certain things are public sector, certain things are better done in the private sector, and like we should not kind of intervene in that. And like certain things are like care, for instance, childcare, healthcare is like very much that kind of sector's thing. So it can also, like, you're very right, and especially with kind of neoliberal kind of urban governance cycles, and which was very much pronounced, I think, in Europe than other parts of the world. Planning and participation especially has become kind of this way of definitely a technocratic kind of like, or like a quantitative we decided that there will be power plants, you decide like where to put them through kind of this promise of as if there's participation. Of course, I think with any kind of political project, there's always a danger that it will be kind of co-opted partly and it will kind of change. I think it depends. Again, I've been reading a lot of one particular author lately who's talking about articulation, populism, and kind of class politics, Gillian Hart. So that's why I've been kind of talking about articulation all the time. It really depends on what kind of other demands we articulate it with, what kind of other politics we articulate it with. So if it's articulated in a neoliberal governance structure, although it came with like a demand from bottom up, it's like then it's kind of, it's going to be a kind of very depoliticized and depoliticizing institutional structure. But if it's articulated with different kind of political actors and political demands, it could be something else. But yeah, thank you I will definitely read up on the Citizen Assembly. Thank you.
Davide, ducci un
Però c'è
punto.
qualcun'altra, io cedo la parola a un
They keep
Ok, per ora c'è del tutto,
tutto.
it's fine. I appreciate that. Nobody's... Okay.
But I want to spend the actual card, so I want to spend
Okay.
Daniel.
Are you negotiating about the question? Come on, answer.
Yeah, because he wants me to shine as a translator. Thanks.
Okay.
La questione della pianificazione del planning issue mi sembra abbastanza centrale perché rispetto ad altre, cioè manca da un po', no, dalla teoria delle utopie, insomma, per cui la questione della pianificazione mi sembra una questione centrale, ma dentro allo schema di incertezza che proponeva, appunto, che è quello che è dato, sia dei limiti biofisici, ma sia anche del legame dell'economia nazionale alle catene globali del valore, eccetera. Il piano autogestionale mi sembra un po' debole, per cui la domanda è, cioè, rispetto alla pianificazione, in che modo pensa di... Perché non è che la questione di pianificazione non è che uno dice l'autogestione non è solo sul piano romantico che non funziona, per me l'autogestione è un buon metodo, ma l'autogestione in uno scenario di incertezza che è quello del collasso, che è l'orizzonte del collasso, è non porre le questioni del fatto che o cambiamo, cioè o si fa, insomma, il socialismo in un solo paese non funziona e in una sola cooperativa men che meno, e soprattutto in questo momento storico qua, e quindi la questione di pianificazione pone un problema di scala quando tu disposti sulla soluzione autogestionale, poi dopo è anche quello che ho capito.
No, let's see. So the planning issue is important, and that's it's fine because for a long time it was not on the agenda of utopian thinking, and it should be there. Okay, but given your framework, so the focus on complexity and uncertainty on the one end, but also the uncertainty given to the fact that even not just single firms or single cooperatives, but like the national systems are integrated within the global value chains. So the issue of scale then becomes quite central, the scaling up of that, because if not, like, socialism in one country historically hasn't, but also socialism in just one cooperative may be not enough. So like the point was scaling up.
That's very true, and I mean, as I was saying during lunch, I am part of a working group, researchers, or like, also politically involved people, one of which you met, Simon, who's involved in democratic planning, and kind of with a particular focus on Quebec, because like Quebec has or could have some kind of independence or autonomy in the future. So a lot of energy and thinking going into what kind of institutions we have for democratic economic planning in Quebec, and or like what kind of institutions we already have that could be popularized in a way or kind of made more democratic. And the question always comes to what are we going to do about foreign trade? Like how we can plan, let's say we can plan today, what we can plan, like what other countries are selling us in a way. And it's not, I have to admit, I'm not in that kind of, I have not thought about that part as much as I have thought about the kind of the necessity of it. But definitely, I mean, the moment I introduced the kind of ontological requirements for this kind of planning, it is in fact, as you spotted, that one cooperative organizing and democratically planning its production is not enough. I mean, that's why it always has to be in a larger context of democratic planning. And I mean, Patrick Devine and Fikret Adaman, for instance, has written about kind of what kind of institutions of it could be. For them, for instance, there will be planning of like market allocation of productive capacity and then like free market exchange in terms of consumption goods. Michael Albert talked about different, I mean, there are models out there, is what I'm saying, to scale it up. And there are more models of it out there in terms of also kind of using digital technologies a lot more in kind of relaying certain information to the decision makers. But for me, what is, as I underlined, what is really important is the process in order to deal with kind of this uncertainty and complexity question. So that means that in order to scale this up, I mean, it has to be some kind of a nested system where decisions from the bottom up feed into up, and that there is some still kind of both like regional, like local and regional councils or institutions also coordinating between themselves. So that's kind of, it needs to be very spatial by the nature of nature. But also kind of a lot of coordination, relatively autonomous but coordinating bodies is what is needed. So what then kind of my colleagues are imagining is a good start. It needs to be regional, like and it needs to be kind of, but at the end of the day, it will require rethinking globalization very fundamentally, very fundamentally. And there are many people from, especially Latin America, working on post-extractivism and trade, who are thinking of kind of like equal regional trade links and kind of also reviving certain institutions that actually World Trade Organization or kind of international organizations we already have had, like in order to facilitate that kind of de-linking and re-linking process. It's not undoable, it's overwhelming, but I think, but your starting point is completely right. It will need scaling up in certain senses because of the very biophysical nature of it.
I will make this short. And I just want to say something that you said before about the students that say that people are greedy and the participation is low. And for me, like you, it's not completely true. But I think that a system of norm and regulation will be very helpful for attract people to this argument, because if you just say to people you can do this, maybe they won't cooperate so much. But if you tell you can do this like this, and you can make something for attract more, it could be more efficiently.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, it was a good point. Agreed. Okay, so we basically took 2 full hours. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Let's go. Pierre?
Have a beer, and then I can have water.
Via. Grazie a chi ha seguito da casa o da dove avete seguito comunque online. Alla prossima, al prossimo seminario CIDOSPEN.